The bell above the door chimed as I pushed my way into Whimsy Wonders, a small, dimly lit shop that smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The air was thick with a musty scent, like an attic that hadn't been opened in years. I wrinkled my nose and glanced around, taking in the narrow aisles crammed with shelves filled with old toys, dolls, and other knickknacks that seemed to stare back at me. "Ah, you must be Jack," a voice croaked from behind the counter. I turned to see a hunched old man with thick glasses perched on the end of his nose. He gave me a thin, almost skeletal smile. "I'm Mr. Whitley. You're here for the job, yes?" "Yeah, that's me," I replied, trying to sound enthusiastic despite the growing unease in my stomach. I needed the money, and finding a job as an artist in Boston was nearly impossible. Running a toy store for a few hours each day seemed like easy enough work. Good, he said, nodding slowly. "But before you begin, there are some rules you need to follow." He reached under the counter and pulled out a small, faded notebook. The pages were yellowed with age, the cover worn and frayed. I took the notebook from him, flipping through the pages. Each one was filled with neat, cramped handwriting detailing strange, almost absurd instructions. I glanced up at him, puzzled. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked, half expecting him to crack a smile. But his expression remained stern. "No joke," he said, his voice lowering to a whisper. "You follow those rules, and you'll be fine. Break them, and you'll find out why no one stays employed here for long." I wanted to laugh it off, but the look in his eyes sent chills down my spine. He was dead serious. I decided not to press him further and stuffed the notebook into my pocket. Mr. Whitley gave me a brief tour of the shop, pointing out the various sections, the dolls, the wind-up toys, the old board games. As I wandered down the narrow aisles, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The glass eyes of the porcelain dolls seemed to follow me, their expressions frozen in perpetual smiles that were far too wide. "Everything is straightforward," Mr. Whitley said as we reached the counter again. "Just remember to close up by 10 p.m. and never stay past midnight." "Got it," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Anything else I should know?" He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the back room. "Just follow the rules. And whatever you do, don't go into the back room. It's off limits." With that, he left me alone in the shop. The bell above the door chimed once more, and the old man vanished into the cobblestone street outside, leaving me to my thoughts. I had barely been alone for 5 minutes when it happened. I was dusting off one of the old shelves when I heard it, a soft, mechanical whirring sound, like the winding of a clockwork toy. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. Rule number 1, if you hear a toy wind itself, do not turn around. The sound grew louder, closer. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to look, to see what was behind me. But I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands shaking as I continued dusting the shelf in front of me. The whirring stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving behind a suffocating silence. I let out a shaky breath and turned around slowly. The aisle was empty. I was alone. Or at least, I hoped I was. I tried to shake off the unnerving experience with the self-winding toy, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Maybe an old mechanism inside one of the toys had wound down on its own. But as I continued my shift, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of the porcelain dolls blinking or moving on its own. The day passed slowly. The shop was mostly empty, save for the occasional curious tourist who wandered in, browsed the dusty shelves, and left without buying anything. The hours seemed to stretch into eternity, the dim light and thick air pressing down on me. By the time the evening came around, I was ready to get out of there and never look back. But I needed this job, and I wasn't going to let a few old toys get under my skin. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the shop, I made my way to the corner where an old rocking horse sat. Its paint was chipped, and one of its glass eyes had fallen out, leaving a hollow socket that seemed to stare into my soul. According to rule number 2, I had to dust it every night before closing. I wasn't sure why, but after my earlier encounter with the self-winding toy, I was willing to follow the rules to the letter. I grabbed the feather duster from behind the counter and approached the rocking horse. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I could feel a chill in the air, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly. I began dusting the horse's mane, trying to ignore the sensation of being watched. As I reached for its tail, the horse creaked forward on its rockers, moving ever so slightly. I jumped back, nearly dropping the duster. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to finish the task. The rules were clear: dust the horse every night, or risk something far worse. As soon as I was done, the chill in the air dissipated, and the rocking horse went still. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Whatever strange energy had filled the room was gone, replaced by the normal, musty atmosphere of the shop. But as I turned to leave, I heard a soft, childlike giggle coming from somewhere deep within the store. I froze, my eyes darting around, but I couldn't see anyone. The sound sent chills racing down my spine. I decided it was time to lock up for the night. The next day, I arrived at Whimsy Wonders determined to finish my shift without any more weird occurrences. Mr. Whitley was nowhere to be seen, as usual, so it was just me and the shop's collection of dusty old toys. I tried to keep myself busy, restocking shelves and cleaning the glass cases that displayed vintage wind-up toys and porcelain dolls. It was around noon when the bell above the door chimed, announcing the arrival of a customer. I turned to see a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a nervous expression on her face. She wore a long coat despite the warm weather outside, and her eyes darted around the shop as if she were searching for something specific. "Can I help you?" I asked, forcing a friendly smile. She hesitated, then leaned in closer, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm looking for something special." I raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you looking for?" The woman glanced around nervously before finally saying, "Do you have Molly's doll?" My heart skipped a beat. Rule number 3, if a customer asks for Molly's doll, politely refuse and ask them to leave. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm sorry, ma'am, we don't have anything by that name. I think you might be mistaken." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she was going to argue. But then, as if something unseen had brushed against her, she shuddered and quickly turned toward the door. Without another word, she left, the bell above the door chiming softly as it closed behind her. I let out a sigh of relief. My hands were shaking, but I had followed the rule. That was all that mattered. But as I turned back to the counter, I noticed something strange. There was a doll sitting on the counter that hadn't been there before. It was old, much older than the other toys in the shop. Its porcelain face was cracked, one eye hanging loose, and its dress was stained with what looked like dried blood. I took a step back, my mind racing. I hadn't put that doll there, and I was certain it hadn't been on the counter when I arrived that morning. Rule number 5, if you find a toy that wasn't there before, leave it alone. Do not touch it. I tried to calm my breathing, resisting the urge to pick up the doll and inspect it. The rules had been clear. I had already dodged 2 bullets. I wasn't about to break another rule just because I was curious. Ignoring the doll, I turned away and focused on restocking the shelves. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, I could have sworn the doll's head had turned slightly, its cracked eye following my every move. By the time I finished my shift, the shop was empty, and the sun had set, casting long shadows across the cobblestone street outside. I locked the door and drew the blinds, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at my stomach. The shop was deathly quiet, save for the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. I was just about to finish closing up when the phone on the counter rang. My heart leapt into my throat. Rule number 6, if the phone rings after closing hours, do not answer it. The phone continued to ring, its shrill tone echoing through the empty shop. I stared at it, my fingers itching to pick up the receiver, to find out who was calling. But I remembered Mr. Whitley's warning, follow the rules, and you'll be fine. I let it ring, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, the ringing stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It was heavy, oppressive, like the entire shop was holding its breath. I turned to leave, but just as I reached for the door, the phone rang again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Sweat trickled down my forehead, and my hands trembled as I forced myself to ignore it. But then, in a moment of weakness, I glanced at the caller ID. There was no number. Just the word Molly flashing on the screen. I yanked my hand back as if I'd been burned and bolted for the door. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, the eerie glow of Whimsy Wonders fading into the distance behind me. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, haunted by the ringing phone and the appearance of the strange doll. I had managed to follow the rules so far, but it felt like the shop was testing me, pushing me closer to the edge with each passing day. The next morning, I arrived at the shop earlier than usual, hoping to get a head start on my tasks before the store opened. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the musty air hit me like a wave. The shop was just as dim and dusty as ever, but something felt different. That's when I noticed it, another doll sitting on the counter, identical to the one I had seen the day before. Its cracked porcelain face was frozen in an expression that looked almost triumphant. This wasn't here last night, I thought, my stomach twisting in knots. The rule said not to touch any toy that wasn't there before. But there were no rules about what to do when the toys started multiplying. As I stared at the doll, the sound of mechanical whirring filled the air, the same sound I had heard on my first day. I froze, my pulse quickening. It was right behind me. Rule number 1, if you hear a toy wind itself, do not turn around. My instinct screamed at me to look, but I stayed rooted in place, my eyes locked on the doll on the counter. The whirring grew louder, closer, as if whatever was winding itself was only inches away from the back of my neck. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the whirring stopped. The shop was silent once more, but the air felt colder, heavier. I forced myself to take a deep breath and turned slowly toward the back room, where the sound had come from. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning me to come closer. But I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The doll on the counter hadn't moved, but its presence felt like a cold weight pressing down on my chest. I forced myself to look away, turning my attention to the task of opening the shop. The bell chimed softly as I unlocked the door, letting in the thin morning light that did little to chase away the shadows lurking in the corners. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shop was watching me. Every aisle I walked down, every shelf I dusted, I felt dozens of tiny glass eyes following my every move. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and dust, thick enough to choke on. I tried to focus on my duties, but my mind kept wandering back to the rules. Why had Mr. Whitley left me with such strange instructions? And why did it feel like every time I followed them, the shop found new ways to test me? It was a quiet day in the shop, with only a handful of customers wandering in to browse. The afternoon crept into evening, and as the sun set behind the old buildings, the shop's interior seemed to grow darker and more foreboding. I busied myself with cleaning the shelves, trying to ignore the creeping sensation of being watched. Before I knew it, it was well past closing time. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already 11:45 p.m. I cursed under my breath, realizing I had lost track of time. Rule number 4, never stay in the store past midnight. The doors will lock you in. The rule flashed in my mind like a neon sign, urging me to hurry. I quickly went through the usual closing procedures, shutting off the lights and locking the cash register. But as I approached the front door, my heart sank. The handle wouldn't budge. I yanked on it, but it was as if the door had fused with the frame. Panic surged through me. The clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight, each second sounding like a countdown to my doom. I was trapped. Desperation clawed at my chest as I tried the back door, but it too was locked tight. The store had sealed itself, trapping me inside. My mind raced, and I couldn't stop the rising dread that maybe this was exactly what the shop wanted. I glanced back toward the counter, where the doll from earlier still sat, its cracked face gleaming in the dim light. I swore it hadn't been facing me before, but now its dead eyes seemed to lock onto mine. Just as the clock struck midnight, the phone on the counter rang. The shrill sound cut through the oppressive silence, freezing me in place. Rule number 6: if the phone rings after closing hours, do not answer it. The phone continued to ring, each shrill note louder and more insistent than the last. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I stood there, paralyzed by indecision. My instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to let it ring until it stopped. But what if this was my only chance to find a way out? What if someone was calling to help me? I took a step toward the phone, then another. My hand hovered over the receiver, every fiber of my being torn between following the rule and finding out who was on the other end. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the ringing stopped. A cold chill swept through the shop, extinguishing the last flickering light bulb above me. The shop was plunged into darkness, leaving me surrounded by shadows. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the inky blackness, but it did little to dispel the eerie feeling of being watched. A soft whisper drifted through the air, so faint that I almost thought I was imagining it. "Jack." The voice was familiar, but it was warped, like a recording played on a dying battery. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the shop, a little girl with long, dark hair, her face obscured by shadows. "Molly?" I whispered, the name slipping from my lips before I realized it. The girl tilted her head, her form flickering like a bad signal on an old TV, and then she was gone. The phone rang again, this time louder and angrier. My resolve crumbled. I grabbed the receiver and lifted it to my ear. "Hello?" I breathed, my voice shaky. There was nothing but static on the other end, interspersed with faint, distant voices. I could just barely make out what sounded like children laughing, their giggles twisted into something sinister. And then, beneath it all, a low, raspy voice whispered, "You broke the rules, Jack. Now you'll pay." A sharp pain shot through my hand, and I dropped the receiver as if it had burned me. My palm was bleeding, a thin, jagged cut that hadn't been there a moment ago. The phone clattered to the ground, and the lights flickered back on, casting their weak glow over the shop. The door behind the counter, the one leading to the mysterious back room, was now wide open. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I stared at the open door, a dark void that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. For as long as I had worked here, the door to the back room had always been locked. I had been explicitly told by Mr. Whitley to never enter it, no matter what. But now, it was as if the shop itself was inviting me in. I took a hesitant step toward the doorway, the darkness beyond seeming to swallow the light from my flashlight. I knew I should turn back, but something compelled me to move closer. Maybe it was the voice on the phone, or the ghostly figure of Molly I had glimpsed. Maybe it was my own insatiable curiosity. I crossed the threshold into the back room, and the air instantly grew colder, the temperature dropping to a bone-chilling degree. The flashlight flickered, and I could just barely make out the outlines of shelves filled with old, dusty boxes and toys. The smell of decay was overwhelming, and I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. The deeper I went, the more the darkness seemed to close in around me. That's when I noticed it, another doll sitting on a small wooden table in the center of the room. But this one was different. It was dressed in a tattered red dress, its porcelain face cracked in a way that made it look like it was smiling. The name Molly was stitched into its clothing with black thread. I could feel its eyes on me, tracking my every movement. I took a step back, my instinct screaming at me to leave, but the door to the back room slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. A soft, mechanical whirring filled the air, and one by one, the toys on the shelves began to move. Wind-up clowns with painted grins, clockwork soldiers marching in place, and tin monkeys clanging tiny cymbals, all coming to life in the suffocating darkness. The doll on the table tilted its head, its eyes glinting in the dim light. "You shouldn't have broken the rules," it whispered, its voice sounding like nails on a chalkboard. Panic surged through me as the toys closed in, their tiny feet scuttling across the floor. I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The darkness seemed to pulse, the air thickening as if the room itself was alive. "Please," I begged, not even sure who I was pleading with. I didn't mean to break the rules. The doll's laughter echoed through the room, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine. "It doesn't matter," it said. "You're ours now." The toys surged forward, their glass eyes reflecting my terror as they swarmed over me, their tiny hands cold and unrelenting. As I struggled, I could hear the sound of the phone ringing again in the distance, growing fainter with each passing second. I screamed, the darkness swallowing my voice as the toys dragged me deeper into the back room, their laughter and whispers echoing all around me. The darkness in the back room swallowed me whole, and for a moment, I was sure I was going to suffocate. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. The laughter of the toys echoed in my ears, a cacophony of giggles and mechanical clicks that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The toys went silent, the darkness retreated, and I found myself standing alone in the back room. My heart was still racing, but the sense of impending doom that had hung over me like a black cloud had lifted, if only slightly. I had to get out of here. But something was different now. The air felt clearer. The oppressive weight that usually filled the shop seemed to have shifted, replaced by a cold, almost clinical detachment. As I looked around, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, an old wooden chest pushed against the far wall, half hidden behind stacks of dusty boxes. The chest was locked with a heavy padlock, but it looked ancient and rusted. Without thinking, I grabbed a nearby crowbar and forced it open. Inside was a collection of old newspapers, faded photographs, and a thick, leather-bound journal. I pulled the journal out, wiping away the dust that covered its cover. The name Edgar Whitley was etched into the leather in delicate gold lettering. My hands were shaking as I opened the journal, flipping through its brittle pages. The handwriting inside was cramped and uneven, as if it had been written in a hurry. The first entry was dated October 3, 1948, the same year the shop had opened. "I have finally secured the perfect location for the toy shop. The alleyway gives it an air of mystery, perfect for attracting curious customers. But more importantly, it is a place where they will not ask questions." I frowned, my pulse quickening. The tone of the entry was unsettling, almost predatory. As I continued reading, the entries became darker, filled with cryptic references to toys that had special properties and the spirits of children that needed to be appeased. Then, I came across an entry that sent chills down my spine. October 17, 1950. I thought it was just a game. But Molly, she wouldn't stop crying. The doll was supposed to keep her company, to keep her quiet. But now, the doll is whispering, telling me to do things. I can't get rid of it. The shop, it won't let me. The name Molly appeared again and again, along with increasingly frantic entries about strange occurrences in the shop, toys moving on their own, shadows that seemed to breathe, and voices whispering in the dead of night. The final entry was almost illegible, written in shaky, desperate handwriting. "The doll is cursed. Molly's spirit is trapped, bound to this place. The rules, they're the only thing keeping her at bay. But I fear it is too late for me. I am a prisoner in my own creation. Whoever finds this, heed my warning, do not break the rules. She is always watching." My stomach churned as I closed the journal. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was horrifying. Mr. Whitley hadn't just been a shop owner, he had been trying to contain something evil, something tied to Molly in her cursed doll. But what had he meant by, "the shop won't let him go"? And where was he now? I turned my attention to the old photographs inside the chest. They were yellowed with age, the edges frayed. One of them showed a young girl with long dark hair standing in front of Whimsy Wonders. She was holding a doll, its porcelain face eerily similar to the one that had appeared on the counter earlier. I flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back in faded ink were the words, Molly, 1949. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Molly wasn't just a ghost that haunted the shop. She had been a real person, a child who had been trapped here, her spirit bound to the cursed doll. And now, somehow, she was using the toys to reach out, to claim more souls to join her. As I looked at the photograph, a cold breeze swept through the room, rustling the pages of the journal. I turned toward the back of the room, where a faint light was flickering. The door that had slammed shut earlier was now wide open again, leading back into the main shop. But something was different. The air was colder, the shadows deeper. I could hear the faint sound of mechanical whirring, the same sound that had tormented me since I first started working here. I stepped back into the main shop, my flashlight flickering as I swept it over the rows of shelves. The toys were still and silent, but there was a new tension in the air, as if they were all waiting for something to happen. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked louder than usual, each second a hammer blow against my nerves. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the shop. It was the little girl again, her long hair hanging in front of her face like a curtain. This time, I could see her more clearly. She was holding the cursed doll, cradling it like a child would hold a beloved toy. "Molly?" I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. She didn't respond, didn't even move. But the doll in her arms turned its head toward me, its cracked eyes glinting with malevolence. The phone on the counter began to ring again, the sound slicing through the silence like a knife. I ignored it, focusing on the figure in the shadows. Molly took a step forward, her feet not quite touching the ground. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The only answer was a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Stay with us, forever." The ringing phone stopped, replaced by the sound of soft laughter that echoed through the shop. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer, I had to find a way out. But as I turned to make my way toward the door, a flash of movement caught my eye. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Whitley. But he was different. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, like a corpse that had been reanimated. His smile was twisted, the corners of his lips pulled back into an unnatural grin. "You should have followed the rules, Jack," he said, his voice a hollow rasp. "Now, you've awakened her." I backed away, my mind reeling. "What are you talking about?" "I did everything you asked." He shook his head slowly. "The shop needs a caretaker, someone to keep the toys satisfied. I thought I could control it, but I was wrong. The moment you broke the rules, you sealed your fate." The air around me grew colder, the shadows seeming to close in. The toys on the shelves began to move again, their eyes glowing in the dim light. Mr. Whitley took a step forward, his skeletal hand reaching out toward me. "You will stay here," he whispered. "You will take my place. The shop demands a soul, Jack, and tonight, it's yours." I turned and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached for the handle, it twisted on its own, locking me inside. I pounded on the glass, screaming for help, but the street outside was deserted. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock, counting down the seconds until midnight. The toys were closing in, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. The cursed doll in Molly's arms grinned at me, its cracked face seeming to shift and contort. I had to think. There had to be a way to stop this. My mind raced back to the journal, to the entries about the rules and the offerings. Mr. Whitley had mentioned that the shop demanded an offering every night. But what kind of offering could possibly satisfy something as malevolent as this place? Then, it hit me. The candy offering. It had been a seemingly simple rule, one I had dismissed as silly. But maybe that was the key. I sprinted to the counter, grabbing a handful of the candy I kept in the jar for customers. I scattered the candy on the floor, praying that it would work. The toys stopped. The air grew still. The laughter faded, replaced by a low, satisfied hum. But it wasn't over yet. The door behind me creaked open, revealing the dark void of the back room. The only way to end this was to confront Molly herself. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the darkness, the shop closing behind me. The door to the back room creaked open, revealing a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing with thoughts of turning back. But I knew there was no escape. The only way out was through. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was waiting beyond that threshold, and stepped inside. The air was different here, stale, cold, and thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something metallic and sour, like blood. The moment I crossed into the room, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, trapping me in complete darkness. I swallowed hard, raising my flashlight to scan the room. The beam flickered weakly, barely penetrating the oppressive shadows. The walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty old boxes and strange trinkets that looked like they belonged in a museum of horrors. Rusted metal toys, cracked porcelain dolls, and old photographs of children with hollow, dead eyes stared back at me. At the far end of the room, illuminated by the faint glow of my flashlight, was a small wooden table. And sitting on that table was the doll, Molly's doll. The doll was larger than I remembered, or perhaps it just seemed that way in the dim light. It was dressed in a once white lace dress that had turned yellow with age. The porcelain of its face was cracked, giving it a grotesque, twisted grin. One of its eyes was missing, leaving a hollow socket that seemed to stare into my soul. I stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The air around the doll was frigid, so cold that I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. As I approached, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic whisper, like a chant that grew louder with every step I took. "Jack. Jack." The voice was coming from the doll, the sound like a chorus of children's voices, layered on top of one another. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, but I forced myself to keep moving. I needed answers. I needed to know why this doll was at the center of everything, why the shop demanded so much from its caretakers. "Molly," I whispered, the name slipping from my lips before I could stop it. "What do you want from me?" The doll's head tilted, its one good eye glinting in the faint light. The air around me seemed to vibrate, and I could feel something pressing against my mind, a presence that was trying to force its way in. I gritted my teeth, trying to block it out, but the pressure was relentless. Then, with a sudden jolt, the room came alive. All around me, the shelves began to rattle, the toys vibrating as if they were coming to life. I heard the soft whirring of wind-up mechanisms, the clattering of wooden blocks, and the clicking of gears turning on their own. The laughter of children filled the air, a high-pitched giggle that sent chills racing down my spine. The other dolls on the shelves began to move, their eyes blinking open one by one. They turned their heads in unison to face me, their painted smiles widening in grotesque, unnatural ways. "Play with us, Jack," they whispered in unison, their voices overlapping in a sickening chorus. "Stay with us, forever." Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, almost dropping my flashlight. I needed to get out of here, but the door was shut tight, trapping me with these abominations. The toys were closing in, their tiny hands reaching out, their glass eyes filled with a malevolent hunger. In my desperation, my gaze locked onto Molly's doll. It hadn't moved, but I could feel its presence, a dark, pulsating energy that seemed to control everything in the room. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until it felt like my skull was going to split open. "You broke the rules," the doll hissed, its cracked lips moving for the first time. "Now you belong to us." I tried to focus, tried to think of what I had read in Mr. Whitley's journal. There had to be something I could do to stop this. Something about the offerings, the rules, the ritual that had been keeping Molly's spirit contained for decades. But the pressure in my head was too much. It was like trying to think through a hurricane. The toys were closing in, their glassy eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, their tiny hands clawing at my legs, trying to drag me down. And then I remembered the last entry in the journal. The doll is cursed. Molly's spirit is bound to it, but it needs something to sustain it, an offering of life. The rules keep it at bay, but once broken, it will take what it needs. An offering of life. That was why the shop had such strange rules, why it needed a caretaker to follow them. The rules were a way to keep Molly's spirit appeased, to prevent it from claiming another victim. But now that I had broken the rules, it was free to take what it wanted. "Please," I gasped, my vision blurring as the pressure in my skull intensified. "I'll do whatever you want. Just let me go." But the doll's grin only widened, and the toys around me began to chant, their voices rising into a deafening crescendo. "Molly wants to play." The pain was too much. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the voices tore through my mind. I could feel my will slipping away, my body going numb as Molly's spirit tried to take control. But then, through the haze of agony, I remembered something else from the journal. Mr. Whitley had written that the doll could be appeased with an offering. But it didn't necessarily have to be a human life, it just needed to be something valuable, something filled with emotion. With the last of my strength, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the old photograph of Molly, the one I had found in the chest. The moment it touched the air, the chanting stopped. The toys froze, their eyes snapping shut. The pressure in my skull released, and I gasped for breath, feeling like I had just been pulled from the depths of a freezing lake. The doll's one good eye fixed on the photograph, its grin fading. "Give it to me," it whispered, its voice no longer taunting, but desperate. I hesitated. This photograph was the last link to Molly's past, the last fragment of her humanity. If I gave it to her, would it finally free her spirit? Or would it just bind me to this cursed shop forever? But I had no choice. If I didn't do something, I would be trapped here, just like the others who had come before me. I placed the photograph in front of the doll, stepping back as the shadows seemed to ripple and twist around it. The doll let out a low, keening wail, the sound so filled with sorrow and longing that it almost brought tears to my eyes. The toys on the shelves began to melt away, dissolving into shadows that were sucked into the doll's cracked porcelain face. And then, with one final whisper, "Thank you," the doll shattered into 1,000 pieces. The shop went silent, the oppressive darkness lifting as if a great weight had been removed. The toys were all still, their eyes lifeless once more. The door to the back room creaked open, letting in the dim light from the main shop. I stumbled out, my legs shaking, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The clock on the wall struck midnight, but this time, the bell was soft, almost gentle, as if it were signaling the end of something. I took one last look at the shattered remains of the doll and the photograph that lay among the broken pieces. Molly's spirit was gone, finally at peace. But the shop would always remain. It would always need a caretaker to keep the darkness at bay. As I reached the front door, I found it unlocked. I stepped out into the cool night air, the scent of rain on the breeze, and for the first time since I had started working at Whimsy Wonders, I felt truly free. But as I walked away, the bell above the door chimed one last time. I glanced back and saw the silhouette of Mr. Whitley watching me from the shadows. His hollow eyes seemed to follow me as I disappeared into the night. The cool night air washed over me as I stepped out of Whimsy Wonders, my heart still pounding from the encounter in the back room. The broken pieces of Molly's doll lay behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the shop wasn't done with me yet. The shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, twisting and curling like smoke in the dim light of the street lamps. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. The street was deserted, not a soul in sight. I was free, at least for the moment, but I couldn't shake the lingering feeling that the shop's grip extended far beyond its four walls. As I turned to leave, the bell above the shop door chimed once more, a sound that sent chills down my spine. The lights inside flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows through the window. My gut twisted with dread. Something was still wrong. I couldn't just walk away, not yet. The shop had taken something from me the moment I walked through its doors, and it wasn't going to let me go that easily. I don't know what compelled me to turn back, but something inside me, maybe it was the remnants of guilt, or just sheer curiosity, pulled me toward the door again. I took one last look at the street, hoping to see someone, anyone, who might pull me back to reality, but the cobblestone alleyway was empty. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped back inside. The shop was exactly as I had left it, dusty, dimly lit, and filled with rows of silent toys. But the air was different now. It was heavier, thicker, almost suffocating. The scent of old wood and decay was more pungent than ever. The door slammed shut behind me, and this time, I heard the unmistakable click of a lock turning. I was trapped. The rules. I had followed the rules, or at least most of them. But something must have gone wrong. The shop was punishing me for breaking its sacred order. A low, raspy voice echoed through the shop, the same voice that had taunted me on the phone. "You thought you could escape, Jack, but you broke the rules." My flashlight flickered as I turned toward the sound. The dolls on the shelves had turned to face me, their glass eyes reflecting the beam of my light, creating 1,000 tiny pinpricks of darkness. I backed away, my heart pounding as the soft whirring of wind-up mechanisms filled the air once again. The toys were waking up. A toy soldier on the nearest shelf began marching in place, its tiny drum beating a slow, steady rhythm. The jack-in-the-boxes popped open in unison, their painted faces grinning maniacally as they swayed back and forth. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath misting in front of me. The whispering started again, the voices overlapping, filling the air with a chorus of taunts and accusations. "You didn't follow the rules, Jack. You didn't listen." The lights overhead flickered, plunging the shop into darkness. I spun around, desperately searching for a way out, but the front door was sealed shut. The shadows seemed to crawl toward me, stretching and twisting like living things. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, the doll. Or at least, what was left of it. The shattered pieces of Molly's doll had reassembled themselves into a grotesque, twisted version of its former self. The porcelain was cracked, and its eyes were missing, replaced by two dark voids that seemed to draw in all the light around them. "Why did you break the rules?" the doll hissed, its voice a distorted echo of Molly's. "I did what you wanted," I shouted, backing away as the doll slowly advanced, its limbs creaking with every step. "I gave you the offering, I tried to appease you." The doll's grin widened, its broken lips splitting open like a cracked mask. "It wasn't enough," it whispered. "You cannot break the rules and expect to leave." The shop was alive with movement now. The toys on the shelves were all moving in unison, their eyes glowing, their tiny hands reaching out toward me. The grandfather clock in the corner began to chime, each strike sending vibrations through the floor, rattling my bones. I turned and bolted toward the back room, the only place that wasn't swarming with toys. The door flew open as I approached, and I threw myself through it, slamming it shut behind me. But the darkness in the back room was worse than ever. The shadows seemed to pulse, and I could hear whispers all around me, like 100 voices murmuring just out of reach. The room was colder than the rest of the shop, the air thick with the scent of decay. I stumbled forward, my hands searching for something, anything, that could help me. My fingers brushed against the old chest where I had found Mr. Whitley's journal earlier, and I yanked it open, searching for any clue that could save me. And that's when I saw it, another journal, hidden beneath the pile of old papers. This one was newer, the pages still crisp. It was Mr. Whitley's final journal, and it held the answers I needed. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, scanning the entries. The journal detailed Mr. Whitley's final days in the shop, his desperate attempts to appease Molly's spirit after breaking one of the rules. "The shop needs a soul, Jack," he had written, his handwriting growing more frantic with each entry. "The moment you break a rule, it binds you here. It needs someone to take my place. Someone to keep the toys satisfied. The curse cannot be broken, it can only be transferred." My blood ran cold. That was it. The shop didn't just want me to follow its rules. It wanted me to take over as its caretaker, to trap me in a never-ending cycle just like it had done to Mr. Whitley. I had been a fool to think I could escape. I had walked right into its trap. But there was one final entry that caught my eye, scrawled hastily in the margins. The offering must be something of value, something personal. Only then can you break the cycle. I frantically searched my pockets, my mind racing. I had nothing left to offer. Nothing except. My eyes fell on the old locket that I always wore around my neck. It had belonged to my mother, the only thing I had left of her. It was priceless to me, a reminder of a life I had lost long ago. But it was also the only thing that might satisfy the shop. The doll was at the door now, its porcelain hands scraping against the wood, its eyes glowing like hot coals. The toys were chanting louder, their voices rising into a crescendo that made my ears ring. I pulled the locket off my neck, my heart aching as I did so. "Take it!" I screamed, throwing it onto the floor in front of the doll. "This is my offering." The moment the locket hit the ground, the shop went silent. The toys froze, their glass eyes going dark. The doll let out a long, keening wail, its body shaking violently. The shadows in the room began to recede, the air growing warmer. For a moment, I thought I had done it. I thought I had finally appeased the shop. But then, with a final, ear-piercing scream, the doll shattered into dust. The toys collapsed, their parts scattering across the floor like broken pieces of a nightmare. The front door burst open, letting in the cool night air. The spell was broken. The shop had accepted my offering, and I was free. The first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon as I stumbled out of Whimsy Wonders. The bell above the door rang one last time, but it sounded almost relieved. I turned back to look at the shop one last time. The windows were dark, the shadows inside still. For now, at least, the shop was at rest. But I knew that it would always be waiting, ready to claim its next victim the moment someone broke the rules. As I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder, had I truly broken the curse, or had I just passed it on to someone else? The answer came in the form of a new employee stepping up to the door, list of rules in hand, as the shop opened for the day. And the cycle began anew. The morning sun was a welcome sight as I staggered away from Whimsy Wonders, my mind racing with everything I had experienced. My heart was still pounding, my hands shaking, and the cold air of the early dawn did little to clear the fog of exhaustion and fear that clouded my thoughts. I had made it out. I had followed the rules, or at least, tried to, and somehow managed to survive the horrors of the shop. But the words from Mr. Widley's journal kept playing over and over in my mind. The shop needs a soul. Once you break a rule, it binds you here. Was I truly free? Or had I only delayed the inevitable? The narrow cobblestone streets were empty as I made my way back to my apartment, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The city was just beginning to wake up, the sky tinged with pink and gold as the sun rose. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch. For the first time in days, I let myself breathe, trying to convince myself that it was over. I was safe. I was free. But deep down, I knew it was a lie. The hours ticked by, and as the light outside faded, the shadows in my apartment seemed to grow darker, deeper, as if they were reaching out to me. I couldn't stop thinking about the shop, about the doll, and about Mr. Widley's twisted grin as he told me that I had broken the rules. The worst part was the silence. The shop had been filled with noise, whirring gears, creaking floorboards, the soft laughter of ghostly children. But now, alone in my apartment, the silence was oppressive. It pressed down on me, thick and heavy, like a suffocating blanket. I tried to distract myself, flipping through channels on the TV, but nothing could drown out the creeping dread that was slowly consuming me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the twisted faces of the dolls, heard the taunting whispers, felt the cold, dead hands reaching for me. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, my phone rang. The sound sent a jolt of terror through me. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. There was no number, just the word Whimsy Wonders flashing on the display. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone. This can't be happening, I thought. I escaped. I got out. But deep down, I knew that the shop wasn't done with me. It never truly let anyone go. With a shaking hand, I answered the call. Hello? My voice came out as a whisper, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. There was nothing but static on the other end, punctuated by faint, childlike giggles. And then, a voice I recognized all too well, Mr. Whitley's hollow rasp. You thought you could leave, Jack, he said, his voice crackling through the static. But you can't escape. The shop chose you. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. I was done with this. I wasn't going back. But as I turned away, the lights in my apartment flickered, and the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But the whispers began again, that same chorus of voices that had haunted me inside the shop. They were faint at first, just a soft murmur, but they grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in on me. Jack. Jack, come back to us, the voices chanted, their tone both pleading and mocking. The shadows in the corners of my apartment twisted and writhed, taking on grotesque shapes. Dolls' faces, painted grins, and hollow eyes seemed to form in the darkness, leering at me from every angle. I bolted for the door, my only thought to get out, to run as far away as I could. But as I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a force that sent me stumbling back. The laughter of children echoed through the room, mingled with the sound of tiny mechanical gears winding themselves. I turned around, and there it was, Molly's doll. It was sitting on my kitchen counter, its cracked face grinning up at me. The locket I had given it as an offering dangled from its tiny porcelain hand. No. I whispered, my voice trembling. I destroyed you. The doll's head tilted, and its mouth opened, a rasping whisper escaping from its lips. You belong to us now, Jack. You always did. My mind was racing. The shop's curse had followed me here. I thought I had broken it, thought I had escaped. But the truth was, the shop had never let me go. It had only given me the illusion of freedom, enough to make me believe I was safe, only to tighten its grip when I was at my weakest. The doll began to move, its tiny porcelain hands twitching as it crawled toward me. The lights in the apartment flickered violently, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced across the walls. I backed away, grabbing the closest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and swung it at the doll. It shattered into pieces, but the laughter only grew louder. The shadows coalesced into the form of Mr. Whitley, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. You can't fight it, Jack, he hissed, his voice echoing around the room. The shop has chosen you. You belong to it now. I was out of options. I had followed the rules, given my offering, done everything the shop demanded. But it still wasn't enough. It was never enough. Fine, I shouted, my voice breaking. You want me? Take me. The shadows surged forward, enveloping me in darkness. I could feel them pressing against my skin, cold and hungry, as if they were trying to pull me apart piece by piece. But I wasn't going to let the shop take me without a fight. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the last thing I had, the old, cursed photograph of Molly. I held it up, hoping it still had some power left, some way to break the cycle. For a moment, everything went still. The shadows hesitated, the voices quieted. And then, with a final, agonized scream, the photograph burst into flames, the shadows retreating as if burned by the light. The doll shattered into dust, and the darkness lifted. The shop, its power finally broken, released its hold on me. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my entire body trembling. The apartment was silent, the oppressive presence gone. For the first time, I felt truly free. The photograph had been the last tether, the final link that bound me to the shop. By destroying it, I had broken the curse. Or so I thought. As I lay there, trying to catch my breath, the phone rang again. The sound sent a jolt of terror through me. I stared at the screen, the word Whimsy Wonders flashing once more. But this time, I didn't answer it. I smashed the phone against the wall, shattering it into pieces. I wasn't going to let the shop take me again. But as I turned away, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A new doll, one I had never seen before, was sitting on my coffee table. Its eyes were bright, its smile wide, and a tiny piece of paper was tucked into its hands. I unfolded it with shaking fingers and read the single line scrawled in Mr. Whitley's familiar handwriting. The cycle never ends. The shop had let me go, but it would always find a way back. It needed a soul, and now it was looking for its next victim. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before it came for me again.